Over to you, Rebecca.
Hi, Caroline. Our final question is based on what a common thread amongst our families has been, and that is how best to approach the subject of death and dying with children in a way that they know it can be spoken about whenever they have questions or fears.
Yeah, so I think as adults, we kind of underestimate how much children are exposed to death and dying and how aware they are. So if you think of any fairy tale, there's always a death. If you think cartoons, you think books, all the Roald Dahl books, I think, have some kind of death. Go outside, you see dead insects, they might have experienced the death of their pets. So actually they are much more aware than we think they are. And also they do not have the same fears as us. So if children start talking about death and dying, then it's really good to address it. And again, the key thing is about honesty, good communication and reassurance, really. So most children, I would say, if learning that their parent has cancer, regardless of the prognosis, will think or say, especially if they're younger, they will say it, are you going to die? So it's best to prepare an answer for that rather than shut it down, because shutting it down means they will think, oh, I'm not allowed to talk about that again. So if you're not ready, if you're not prepared, then you don't actually have to say much. You can just say nothing's certain yet or whatever. It's just saying something that doesn't make them feel like this topic is off the table. So basically, depending on the circumstances, obviously what your response is going to be will differ. But I think, first of all, looking at the language, really. So children get really confused because as a culture, we're rubbish at talking about death and dying. So we start using these words that are different from death and dying. So, but that can be very, very confusing. So if we say someone has kind of passed or been or lost, their children are very literal. So they think, well, if they're lost, we can find them. And some people say they've gone to sleep, and that can make children quite fearful around going to sleep. And other things is like, oh, they've gone away, and children might feel abandoned with that kind of language. So it's really good to sort of try and use death, dying. And again, they won't have those fears that we have as adults talking about it. So younger children under the age of 5 don't really understand the finality of death, really. They feel it's a bit like a cartoon character. Yeah, they'll pop up again, you know, and carry on. So for younger children to sort of explain what death is, it's quite good to sort of say, you know, the heart will stop beating, they will stop breathing, the body will stop working, and they won't feel or see anything. And that's quite a good thing for them to start thinking about. So older children, sort of beyond 5, sort of 6, 7, really will understand kind of what death is, and you can talk to them much more like you would with an adult. So it's kind of worth noting here. So aged about 5, in child development, children will suddenly understand that death is permanent. It's a sort of a final state. So for some children, and this is really, really common, regardless of what's going on in their life, they can become obsessed with death. They can really like obsess over it and talk about it, you know, to us, it just seems, you know, absurd. But it's quite common because they suddenly in their own lives, they're like, oh, right, this could happen, and this could happen to me, and this could happen to my mum and to my dad. So they become quite consumed by it. So the way to support them is to just listen to their worries and listen to their concerns and be with them and communicate with them that they are not alone in these worries. And it's quite nice to use, there's some really nice books. So one is called I've forgotten it now, Dragonflies and Water Bugs, I think. And that just talks about the life cycle. And you can do this online, but the life cycle is a really nice thing because actually it just includes death as a part of life. It's a normal thing, it's a normal process. Another thing is Badger's parting gift, which again, it's about, you know, a badger dying and they are leaving, but actually it's sort of, it's a nice kind of way of introducing death and just talking about it. And again, it's showing the fact that you're open to talking about this. This is a subject that's normal and we should be talking about it. Films wise, the brilliant Coco, brilliant Soul that came out last year, and the Book of Life, totally recommend. And they're great because they're animations, they're designed for kids, you know, and this can spring up great conversations around death, and it's not this kind of fearful kind of sort of dark place that we won't go to. So if the prognosis is incurable and death is likely to happen, then, you know, telling a child that their parents are going to die gives them the opportunity to then spend time with them. If they don't have that knowledge, then how are they going to do that, really? So again, it's the same as being first sort of diagnosed. It's rehearsing, knowing what you're going to say, when you're going to say, how you're going to say it, choosing the right time and a calm place. And sometimes it's quite good to let the child lead, because sometimes they will know more than you think that they do. So you don't have to tell them everything. You can just sort of gradually tell them bits and pieces, and this is often referred to as a jigsaw approach. So you can tell them a little bit and a little bit, but the idea is that you are giving an accurate picture of what's happening, so no sort of false hopes kind of thing. And again, being physically close to them, sitting next to them, holding hands, being on the same level as them is all really, really good. Because if you fumble with the words or kind of don't know the answers, it's fine. And actually being close is like a just as important thing to do. So what should you say? So reassurance, start with reassurance, is always really good. So you want to reassure them that actually they are loved and the illness hasn't taken away any of your love for them. You want to reassure them that they will be informed, that they won't be just left without any knowledge of what's going on. And you want to reassure them that nothing they have done or said has caused the illness, because even older children might have this thought. Sometimes I know that's irrational. So it's a bit like Father Christmas. So some children still believe in Father Christmas, but they know that a man cannot go around the world delivering presents to everyone, but they still believe in it. It's like this dual sort of thinking. So it's quite good, even if they're a bit older, just to remind them that nothing they've done, nothing they've said has caused this illness. So you want to also be able to really reassure them that asking questions is fine and is good, and having that time and space to do it. So you could start with what the doctors have said. So you could say, you know, the doctors have said that I'm ill. They will make sure that I'm not in pain, but they can't make me better. Or you could say that I've done everything and the doctors and nurses have done everything to try and keep me living, but the treatment's no longer working. And if you've had a previous diagnosis and that's changed, you could talk about the changes now, because they will know about the previous diagnosis. So you could say, you know, the cancer's come back, the treatment that we were using is no longer working, and when this no longer works, my body won't work properly, and once my body doesn't work properly, I will die. So your child will become upset with these conversations, most probably, but just to know that it's not the actual conversation that's distressing for them, is actually the thought and the knowledge and the pain of them losing their parent. And if words fail, as I said, just hug and kiss, and you can take your time and you can go back and stuff. So you need to sort of give your children time to absorb actually what's being said, and as they might not say anything, and don't expect your child to say anything, because they might need time to digest what's happening, because they will probably continue to process the conversations afterwards. And that's why it's really good to have an opportunity for questions, and I know that that's okay for those questions. And try not to sort of make them feel embarrassed or shamed about some of the questions that they may ask, depending on their age. So some children may ask really strange, odd questions, like, what's it going to be like in a coffin, or how long does it take to get to become a skeleton, and all these kind of different things that to us as adults make, feels it's kind of insensitive, but to them they're just talking about it. So try not to shut that down, and if you're unable to answer it, just don't brush it away, but just give a vague answer or distract or something like that, or say we can answer that one later on. So another good thing is to remind them that dying is not a deliberate choice. You don't want to leave them, and that's all, again, it's all in their reassurance, to reassure the child. If the child has no reaction, it can be really painful for you, because you've had the courage to bring up this, to start these conversations. But yes, just to remember to understand that actually that's their way of dealing with it, and they need time to digest the information, and they will come back with questions. So it's quite good to keep those conversations going by having little prompts, so you could write these down beforehand, and it's just a good way of checking in really how they are doing. And this is going to be done straight after the conversations, or just continue to do it. So some of these prompts can be something like, is there anything worrying you at this moment that we can talk about? And then you could also then say, how are you feeling? And it's quite good because some children don't feel like they can articulate feelings. So another top tip is to get their cuddly toy, especially if they're younger, and use a cuddly toy as almost a vehicle of talking through them. So often children sort of transfer their fears or their emotions onto, they can talk about it a bit easier if they go, yeah, he's he's feeling sad or whatever, and you can interpret that in some way. And other prompts could be, what would you like to know now? And then, how do you feel about what I've told you? And how can we look after each other? And one final really good thing is to try and get them to explain what you've just told them to somebody else. So you could say, if you were going to tell your best friend what I've just told you, how would you tell them? Or if you're going to tell so-and-so, what would you say? And that's a really good way to check in to see, A, whether they've understood what you said, and B, whether there's bits that you need to fill in. So how your children might react, often first reactions are disbelief. Lots of time it's anger, and that anger can be towards you. And sometimes they appear not to care at all. And these are all normal, and a sense of grief is starting, and this is called pre-bereavement grief, and it can be quite complex because they're feeling grief and all those different emotions that grief holds, but also sometimes they still have this hope of recovery, so it's quite a complex time for them. But actually, gradually over time, they will then learn to accept reality and what is happening. And the final thing I'll say is that children tend to grieve differently from adults, and this is often called jumping puddles, or jumping in puddles, or pockets of grief. So adults tend to grieve quite consistently, and children jump into pockets of grief. So one minute they're just happily playing, laughing, doing seemingly normal, and the next time they're in a little puddle or a pocket, and that can be anger, sadness, withdrawal, whatever, and then they jump out again. So that's quite an important thing to look for, really, and that can happen months before, because grief actually is a loss of something. So there could be a loss of their home life before the parent dies. It could be a loss of all the changes that they're experiencing. So it's good to watch out for that.